Hey, we are back again with Eli to record the second part of our conversation from last week. How you doing, Bonnie? How you doing, Eli?
Great.
Hello, hello.
A peaceful Sunday.
It is a peaceful Sunday, and it's really interesting recording this today because about a week went by since we last spoke and recorded all this about the July forecast, and it was really appropriate to talk about the things that were coming up in Eli and your work because of the Mars and Aquarius themes and the Mars retrograde themes and the lunar eclipse and the South Node in K2, and all those things have to do with going out to the fringes and removing things from the central structure. And also today that we're recording is the sun is trine Neptune today, the sun in Cancer and Neptune in Pisces. And so there's like a heavy Neptunian signature to the day. And I know my dreams were really crazy last night, and there's multiple reasons for that. The moon was also conjunct Uranus as people were going to sleep in this part of the world, and then it squared Mars and squared the North Node and squared Mercury. But also just that Neptunian nature in that Piscean nature, and the Piscean process, like, is so both Neptune and Pisces are so kind of anti-Mercury, and Mercury's like organization and detail and analysis and all the small parts and processes, and Pisces and Neptune both blend everything together and make this kind of amorphousness, this where that kind of psychic intuitive connection can be seen, but also it's like basically like you're in a psychedelic experience. And I was thinking that a lot about what we began talking about last week about the parsed unit and the smooth plane, and that like it's weird to have it. It's almost like to take away the parsed unit is kind of like this anti-Mercury effect that's similar to the Pisces process, but it's interesting because that involves an amount of separation, like pulling away some of those details or some of that structure. And that reduction, it's kind of like reducing it. And that separation itself is an action of air element. And that's ruled again by Mercury. So you kind of get, it's like Mercury on both ends. Like you're kind of like removing the air bubbles from the water, but it's like a Mercury thing to do to make the water calmer at the same time. It's really strange.
Do you think, I know I said last time that I didn't believe in numbers, which is, a little bit of a metaphor in itself. Like, of course, I understand them. It's hard not to believe in revolutions, even though you can still view those as phenomenal as well. But in that regard, do you think Mercury is about organization because it has a tighter and quicker revolution, and so we can sense that as the units of revolution happening in like a quicker way to us than the outlying planets that, they're just kind of cruising, and we don't really have to think of their revolutions in context of our daily life as much.
Yeah, totally. I think you're definitely right. And it's kind of like what you were saying about, you were comparing it to like an analog wave. It's just like a tighter sine wave or something, you get like you get it's like the oscillation is more frequent, and it's cool that you bring up revolutions too, because the way I was thinking about that too is almost like rather than like a linear like narrative of details, it's like a more spherical geometry, like just like how you're saying, like the Earth spinning and then you see all the details of the stars. That doesn't like necessarily like freak you out, it's like organic, it's not like oh, here's a bunch of like ones and zeros coming at you. It's a whole array of information,
And what's one Neptune cycle? How many years is that?
I believe it's around 120 years.
Yeah, so, we don't even process one of those in our lifetime, so we don't have to count them, is I guess what I'm trying to say. It is a smoother system.
Yeah, true. Totally true. Yeah, and that's...
Like, if we talk about our experiential duration of life, obviously some being is counting them because they're experiencing those thousands and thousands of years, but we don't have to.
Yeah.
So we organize to Mercury because it happens, in under 100 days.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a really good point. And then that, unless you're like when, the centurion, like by, I think a lot of cultures talk about how if we were at our optimum, like if there's no pollution in the world, we'd get our like average 120-year cycle,
Right.
Which we'd die sometime around like a Neptune
the
return.
Ideal state. Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, we'd get that final release, so that's really interesting, and that made me think about reduction in general and smoothing, and I was thinking about different ways that you'd smooth something, and I kept thinking about it as like a sphere because I started thinking about it as spherical geometry, but there's like reduction, like Saturn style reduction, which is from restriction, and then there's reduction by blending, like how we were saying with Neptune, and then also by abrasion, like sanding the object down until there's less.
Right.
Do you see any of those as kind of fitting how you're looking at it, or is the smoothing not happening by reduction really at all?
To be determined. I still don't really know. I've had like an internal feeling about it my whole life, and different times when I didn't want. You look at something like mathematics. I was good at it as a child, and then as soon as I had sort of like the philosophical ability to decide it wasn't for me, you see those specialized canons get so narrow. I was like, well, I'm not going to fit in there for very long because you just have to get better and better at this one tiny little thing. It's one of those lenses where, like most of the sciences, if you continue to view the world through those lenses, you get finer and finer tools that are tools of explaining the world through that particular lens better and better. And you remove those tools and everything sort of falls apart. We definitely watched that in like the quantum revolution of the 20th century where, there was like two competing mathematical models that people looked at the world through. Back to the metaphor of building the house, you apply them to a practical means and they work very well, and then you try to apply them to another way to do something and they don't work very well at all. I didn't know any of that as a teenager, of course, but now that it's sort of like turning me upside down again, I don't know yet. I don't know which ones I want to utilize and which ones I don't. I was reading these guys that think that numerals are real, but numbers are not, and I don't quite know where they're going just yet.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, children and animals and, we'll make categories that knows the difference between 2 apples and 3 apples and all these abstractions like that. But as soon as you turn it into the number 1 and the number 2 and the number 3, it's a complete abstraction. It has nothing to do with like what we see as matter,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So don't know yet. I was also good at the computer when I was younger, and then I went through like 15 years where I didn't want to use one, and I think I'm waiting on smooth computing. I think that people that look at the future see computers as like making human beings or inventing matter or teleportation or all these things that we, I think, presumed that digital technologies would bring us to, but I don't think that's going to be possible when we're still off and on-ing everything.
Totally.
To record data as ones and zeros, I think will have its limit, even though you can make those smaller and smaller and smaller to the most like insanely beautiful degree of replication. It's still just an abstract model of a smooth thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that means that computers will eventually not work with a smooth spectrum. I think they might, or it might be like a wave-based computing where you still have the oscillations, like we're talking about revolution, but it's a continuous line. If we use that word as also an abstraction, but I think there will be smooth computing, but just to back off it a while. Go back to analog musical technologies, drawing, just to not think of things as all divided up like that. Like, that's our sickness as a culture, is having divided every single possible thing we can divide, and even thinking we can do that with, like, what we see as pure, like mathematics, or all these things that are still just these tiny little divisions. So,
yeah, yeah, totally. Go on.
Looking ahead to something smoother.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've thought about that in similar terms before, like that the binary 0 and 1 is kind of like an expression of Mercury in like opposite and paradox, and Mercury is so computing, but Mercury is also multiplicity, and like the androgen and the pandrogen, like the combination of opposites that can be everything, and it's
right.
Like instead of zeros and ones, like a world where it's like, you know, like x or n to infinity, you know, where it starts like leaning harder into variables, like rather than units, and then it almost becomes language again rather than numbers. Like if you allow like numerals to be even things like phonemes or something, you know. You see that like in the Greek magical papyri, and it goes. I was thinking about this in terms of like different forms of smoothing and reduction when I was pondering the topics. Those diminishing triangles that they call wing formulas often. You know, everyone knows the one of like abracadabra, like reducing down to an A. And the way I talked about this in the discussion we just had with Suzanne as well about the herbal forecast, but it's really interesting that the words they use to refer to them in the papyri itself, they call them like wings, or they also call them heart shaped, or they also call them like grape shaped, but
like a bunch of grapes.
Yeah, it's really weird. The word for that they use for heart means more like the source of emotion and love, but it also means like the mind and the stomach, or any hollow vessel, and that's cardia, where we get like, you know, cardiac. And then the other one is the word is like, I'm not going to say this right, but it's like botrus, something like that. I'm not saying it right at all, but that is the one that like means almost grape shaped. But if you look at the etymology of that word, it also is like shares an etymology with pre-Hellenic snake, and also stork, and the word bearded, which is like how the grapes all hang in a beard and make that shape of letters, and also and also it's like a botanical word that where they use the word snout, like they would say like the example on this etymology page is like the flowers of the lupine plant are arranged in a snout. and it relates to the uvula too, like in the hanging ball in the back of your throat, and so it connects back to that you're using your voice to describe these letters, and this is all magic that was directed towards the sky and the stars and the rotation. And so when I start thinking about smoothness and computing, I start thinking about like these older ideas that came from human minds rather than technological frameworks, where they were, you know, there was this technology going on between ideas, the imagination, image, like letters and language, and stuff was happening. You know, there was an interface happening, but and of course numbers especially come into it later as you get into like the Pythagorean like revolutions, and they were certainly using numbers before, but I don't know, I started thinking about imagining what you might be envisioning as like holographic and smooth computing, kind of like number and stuff you had said before about numbers and how you deal a lot with language and letter, of it kind of like allowing it, computers somehow allowing themselves to be non-numeral.
Yeah, we talked about it. I can't remember how much in the last conversation and how much was off record. when you get into even like magical literatures, like we talked about before, triple meaning, double meaning, when you have a body of magical literature and it's interpreted in the way we've been trained to interpret language, it leads to people, like we've talked about, like drinking mercury and doing all these things that might have been metaphorical. Same thing with magic numbers. It's like, I think in a pre-computer world, when computation was done by humans, we did see it as metaphorical. So you had magical number systems that were poetic. They weren't about law. They were about poetry. And I hate to make that be such a division, but when we use words in a logical-based system that demands a certain meaning out of that syntax, you have law. Like, we need those words to make laws. We need those words to enforce order as a governing oppressor. But you go to poets, and they put two words next to each other that don't seem to go right, and it expresses like a new type of emotion or a magical type of emotion or feeling or conjuring. And I do think that was happening with numbers before we enforced them as a logical system as well. And that might have been a smoother time when numbers were new. It's weird to think that those ideas were new at some point because they're just abstractions. I don't think of them as real.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like how does a dog quantify and count? There must be some of that going on.
And we know that because there's systems of counting that involve 12, and there's systems of counting that are based on 10, and there's not even like a true way to do any of that because it's all abstraction. It's all just like applied knowledge to build more tools or something, or get more finite detail out of some particular system.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, like one of the older ones is like having something, then having it again, then having it again,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really
and
interesting.
We know when they were invented to keep record,
Right, yeah. Yeah, like there's
like count things you own and count things you sold to another person and then count the interest on that trade.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the whole idea that like law, alphabet, and monotheism all came at the same time with like the Abrahamic texts, and before that even like or similarly like the building of, I think it starts with like irrigation for agriculture, and that becomes road building, and that becomes city building,
Right.
But that they've, I don't know how they come to this conclusion, but it makes organic sense that there's a lot of ideas coming out now that, and we talked about this, I think, off record before, but that poetry and poetic logic and wordplay predate instructional and logical and analytical language, and we know that now, and so it just would make sense that the same would be true about number.
Mm-hmm.
And it got to the point where not only were we building houses, but we were measuring the speed of light, like something that in a particular worldview is instantaneous. And even though we think we've measured it, we know how fast it is, we've imagined things that are faster, we definitely know everything else is slower. That's just still a particular way of like counting it. Like in a whole other way of looking at things, light is an entirely uncountable phenomenon,
Yeah.
So we've done that with counting electrons, which we swear we know how many they are and where they are, and then when pressed to explain that further, they're like, well, they might not be there, and they might actually not be real. They might just be like energy, but we can still draw them and count them, and I don't know. You get more and more finite with those measurings, and they stop making sense at all. So
yeah, they're just like predictive measures until they don't work anymore in certain situations.
Right.
Yeah, you had mentioned light a bunch in our correspondence, and I want to talk more about that, but maybe open it up into I was thinking about you were talking about working into the 4D, and I really feel like your stuff does that anyway. Like when you're doing something that's not there, or when you're reducing something, like when you're like with the scriptomancy being invisible, but maybe the sound is there, and working into like another, taking a step back from another dimension that things might be happening in. I was wondering if you've thought about doing talismans in glass etching, and like that light also flowing through there. Like, as I know in astrological magic, there's, I don't know if I haven't found this in any text, and I might still be looking for that, but it's a general consensus from practice amongst astrological magicians that paper talismans don't only hold a charge for a couple months, or sometimes a few months, but that's why you're supposed to eat them or bury them or something. That's what, when I give them out, I always tell people, you don't have to keep this. Right. Yeah. You can gift it or burn it or eat it or bury it. Eat it. Yeah, I like eat it. I haven't thought of that. Yeah. In the food sigils, there was always like a specific instruction. I know we've talked about this before in the past, but yeah, because paper isn't permanent, which is awesome. Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and so they're great for shorter term effects that you want. Like you might, like for instance, like a road closing working, where you're like, I want all my opportunities to close except for one, so that I know that that's the one thing I should do. You don't want that narrowness always. That's not the one you do
for your whole life.
Yeah, in like copper or as
glass.
But yeah, what about glass? Like metal and stone are permanently and enduring. But glass is somewhere in between. I don't know yet. I think the vehicle of capture will give itself when it's ready. Paper's interesting, like you said. We've learned like an art market that has somehow tried to place value and permanence on them, and it's made me try to treat them as precious. And then all of a sudden, I just started like handling them and stacking them poorly, and like punching holes into them to stick them to the wall. Like they're nicer as like these casual objects that are a little filthy. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Sort of actually used in their impermanence. Yeah. Yeah, I just saw like a copy of one of the Marseille decks in a museum in Minneapolis from the 1600s that was all hand painted, and you can see the rough edges, and you're like, people, someone labored over this, or several people, like teams of people, and then they're just shuffled and carried around, that
in a fine bag, I'm sure. Yeah,
or in a golden chest, is like very common for precious things to be carried in antiquity. I fall into this traps of how is this going to last, or how am I going to be able to show it to people or whatever, and I kind of don't care right now. I really think I like what I'm doing, and I do it for myself, and that's all there really is. So
it's a wonderful
right now I'm having the trouble, like we said, of the 4D calligraphy in how to capture it, but really, like, maybe not. I don't know. Like, I'm already doing it and even performing it, so they're already there. Mm-hmm. If I want to utilize a digital technology so I can like show it through a screen to people that weren't there, I guess I'll need to do that, especially if you want to share it past those 20 people that you do it in front of, but I don't know yet. Yeah, it was making me think of like remote viewing too. Like you can do it in 4D and then maybe do some sort of basic, if you like learn some remote viewing technique to like, and then in a group, like everyone can go back to the point where the 4D expression happened and like analyze it, Right, like claim the space. Yeah. Or even like in a more organic sense from remote viewing, like some sort of like journeying element, go back and kind of like bring the spirit of the 4D expression back, Right. Yeah, I'd like to see them, I guess, is the main reason. I'll have to figure out a version of capturing, because I do want to see the shape, Mm-hmm, yeah.
Like a giant glow stick.
Yeah.
And dark.
Yeah, there's definitely, those Picasso photographs where he's like throwing a bowl face with like a,
right.
I don't know what it is, like a candle or something with light
Yeah.
on the end of it. And
Yeah.
then they did a long capture with a
Mm-hmm.
photograph. It's on a flat plane, even though he was in a three-dimensional plane. Its representation was 2D in the end because we saw them as photographs. But it's just like, I get real excited, and then somebody goes like, well, there's like virtual reality drawing programs on your computer. And I just go like, oh, man.
Yeah.
Which is just like, I'm bored already and I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure like that, drawing things with embers like that you're holding in the dark, like goes back
Right.
to ancient magic and ancient art. And, when you get in altered states in time, you feel like time slows down. That's like when you can, or with entheogens, that actually time does slow down, that you could just
Right.
see the shape someone's drawing just stuck there,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As you see like the tracers on your hand or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, you just start to see more of like, it flattens the whole plane of time.
Right.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying about light in general and thinking about like planetary correspondences to colors and the doctrine of signatures and like the Neoplatonic, like the spheres descending and people putting colors
Right.
into these categories that weren't so, they're categories, they're numerical divisions, but they're organic because there's endless interplay rather than there just being like these boxes that things are shoved into.
Yet, there's countless systems where we've thought we've counted every single possible variation of the color. You can get a book or get a fucking computer screen to what the exact number is of certain colors, even though that's like the smoothest spectrum there ever was.
Yeah, it's yeah, totally.
I've spent a good amount of time. I don't know. I never really studied light as a constant spectrum. The color field being just a tiny part of that spectrum. Going, if we use like the chakra as the line, going north of indigo into like ultraviolet and then gamma ray and et cetera, until you get to light you can't see that way, and then going south of red to infrared all the way to microwave and AM and FM radio. Like I never really
Right, yeah.
thought about all that before, but it's all visible in some strange way. We just have this limited spectrum of seeing that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting like that in what they refer to as astrology in India is Jyotish, which, where we use the words astrology as like the study of the stars. Jyotish means the science of light, so they think of it more as the spectrum of lights, and the words for the planets are grahas, which mean more like a pull. So not thinking them as much as objects in space like giant rocks or giant balls of gas, but like these pulls in the light, that's so much more nuanced just in it's a linguistic expression,
Right. And we know bees don't see white like we see white. They see these like insane color fields when they look at flowers that we don't see as colorful. I like thinking of the pigeon, and I don't know how much of this is just my imagination, but I'm sure it's partially real. You see like a little shimmer on a pigeon, which we sort of think is like gray and trash-like and like the side of the street colored. But the pigeons, like looking at each other, see these like dazzling color fields. They see that shimmer, but they see way more of it than we see. So they don't see each other as like street color. They see each other as this iridescent sparkle, like peacocks looking at each other or something. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that pink and aqua.
Right, birds in general.
Yeah, that would be a good like practice to like just start there. Just like look at the pigeons and like just find the color,
So in the holographic universe model, which graph has been unfavored for movement, so I think the term those people prefers holomovement, not holographic. But
Mm.
in holomovement universe theories, there's only light. So that entire light spectrum is also what we think of as matter. And matter would in fact be an interference pattern between two opposing wave fields, right? So you throw two pebbles in the water and they make their little vibrational rings, and when they meet, they make an interference pattern, and that actually is what causes three-dimensional reality as we see it. Like what we see as matter is actually still just the energy that light is made of.
Right. Yeah, like once something's vibrating, you can feel
Right.
it. You can put your hand towards the vibration and be like, something's here,
Right.
Yeah.
And what in the holograph, as it's when that science was invented in the 80s, and people had already theorized it prior to that. The beauty of it is when you shoot the laser at the object and produce the hologram, you then can take any part of the hologram will reproduce the entire whole of the object that it's holographing.
Right.
So in the transposed metaphor for what we think of as matter or reality or consciousness is that any single tiny part consists of the whole. So that would be not only the entire universe, but time going prior and in front of us.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around all that right now.
Yeah, totally. I think we're all going to have to wrap our minds around that, like, in not too long, as it seems like that's where kind of at least the interface, or like what's outputted from computing, even before the computing itself becomes smooth, and it might lead the way to the computing to become smooth, is
Right.
Once we stop holding devices in our hands, and they just, instead of having say like an internet router in the room, there's just a router that is like a holographic or medium, that you can
Right.
open screens in three-dimensional space and an interface like you would with your phone, but you could also open up games or open up other things that, like, once they involve vibration in it, that you can like
Right.
touch these things, and then at that point they won't really need to be manufacturing physical things anymore, or very few things. So that combined
Right.
with 3D printing and and like the ability of surveillance to see like how much stuff is needed in a certain place, so there's not excess, can drastically reduce like how much impact we put on the world, and on the environment, by like there's like almost nothing. We're not using anything anymore. That's we're not relying on earth materials to produce the things that entertain
Right,
us.
like packaging, like all of our as a human body, like our worst traits.
Oh,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah. So that's kind of a digression, but it reminds me of this whole thing of what we're talking about is as a culture, or if you can call like the human race as a whole a culture, turning towards ideas that are similar to the ones we're talking about. And that's really in the astrology too. Like in 2020, the Jupiter and Saturn conjunction happens in Aquarius. And so for 200 years, they happen almost always in the same sign, with like an exception. But if you average it, it does always happen in the same, not sign, but element. And if you average it, the mean conjunctions always happen in the same element. And they've been in earth elements for the past 200 years. And the next set is going to be in air elements, and they start in 2020. And so if you look back through history and analyze it as like, okay, what fits into this element, what fits into this element, it really clearly tells a story of what was going on in history at that time. And almost all of the industrial period of human culture, just like barely a little of it, just kind of like the startup of it happened in the previous epoch, and almost all of it has happened in the Earth epoch. So what we're headed to next, really, like, there's obviously going to be some sort of drastic shift, and we have Uranus and Taurus standing right on the border. Like he just went into Taurus, and Uranus will be there for 3.5 years in the Earth epoch, and the second half of Uranus and Taurus is 3.5 years in the air epoch. So it's really like, and whenever Uranus is in Taurus, like there's major shifts in art as well as materials and food. And I think this time it's going to be a lot of like ecological technology, but it's like
everything that we need like right now.
Yeah, totally. All the stuff that's there, but just hasn't been installed, you know?
Right.
Like you can read about amazing, world and life-saving technology after technology, but it hasn't been like, it hasn't been distributed into society and into the populace. It's not in the interface yet, you know, but as that happens, I feel like we'll really see holographic, people interacting with holographic reality much more. And
right.
Naturally by doing that, we're going to ponder what it means, you know, as a culture that, you know, as a species, we kind of analyze, well, what is the meaning of this, or philosophize and analyze, you know? So it'll be really interesting to see where people's minds go with how they see reality as they start pondering the holograph more.
Right. And hopefully we won't have to wait till a power holder designs an economic system of domination around the technology, and maybe people will just embrace it and push them out this time.
Yeah, certainly. Well, yeah, I feel like it'll be really interesting to see what's the nature of air signs rather than the nature of earth signs. Like, earth signs has that Venusian rulership in Taurus, but the other signs have, you know, there is that like imperial model. Territory is important in earth signs, you know, where suddenly territory doesn't become important anymore. Stuff doesn't become as important, you know, like it's
right.
Like how millennials prefer open source to ownership, you know.
Right. My sister doesn't have any books, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Before we started recording, we were speaking of millennials, about younger people and the music scene in New York right now. Do you want to describe that experience?
Right. You know, we all grew up in a certain type of rebellious form of music. The one that we came out of was punk, and it seemed so rebellious and so pure in its way when it was like the first thing you heard that wasn't on the radio. And then as you got older, you were like, wow, this is a little redundant, and I wish I knew about other forms of experimental music growing up. I'm 40 now, so this is a time when the internet didn't give you instantaneous access to music. So now young people at least have a little bit more of a choice besides where they're growing up and what happens to be going on as being the type of music they like. But at the noise show on Friday, which seemed to be all the like New York giants of noise doing their giant noise set, has become pretty normal of a environment for me to find myself in. But there was a lot of kids from New York that are young club kids, which are starting to hang around. And their first rebellious form of music was, techno and all its derivatives. And a lot of them decided to come to this show and were at the noise show for the first time, which they pretty brightly understood as just the full spectrum of the same music they were listening to, like sort of like a ungated techno, just like all the like the bass frequency and the snare frequency and the hi-hat frequency just all on all the time. Was I know that's what led us all to noise in the first place, as not even as makers of it, but just understanding it, was that that you weren't counting anymore, or you weren't even like looking at notes and harmony, you were looking at all of it at once. It's sort of where like open jazz took us, was eventually just to noise, and then you're like, oh, then you have people that listen to that. But I don't know, it was cool to hear kids hear it for the first time, which I haven't been able to really think about for the last 10 years.
Yeah, we haven't really had that option of just like, hey, here, think about noise until there was that distance. But yeah, it's interesting.
Right. I remember
Oh, go ahead.
The opposite happened. God willing, Ren Schofield, who started playing music as a container, when we met him 10, 15 years ago, he was making noise, right? And then he was one of the first sort of friends in our community to switch that to techno. And I remember seeing for the first time, instead it was the reverse. Instead of like the full spectrum blast, all of a sudden it was just like, it was just like gated little moments of his full spectrum noise. It's like, wow, that's all a drum machine is, like little gated blasts of noise. And
Right.
it was like some of my, like 10, 12 years ago, like starting to process that, which now we know what synthesizers and all that is. It's just like gated flows of electricity, but I didn't know that back then.
Yeah, it's like what you were saying about the hologram. Everything is in each part, and they're in each other. And it's like what we were saying in the beginning of the smoothing stuff out. And techno can be so binary, where you're like the beat is so rigid and the riff is so canned or something. It's like, but that you can also hear that people who are their parameters of hearing music are set that way. They can hear all that stuff happening in the noise, like how you can hear like a riff in like a lawnmower,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then some of the, not to say there's anything bad with making techno that's super processed and computerized and stuck on a beat, that can put you in trance states too, as we know. It's just, I think when it's not understood as such is when it's problematic.
Yeah.
Like now you have all music being counted on a computer, and so there's a little bit of that human touch that's missing when you have music that's made in the 21st century.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, certainly.
But at the time when that kind of music was new, it was obviously very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot more there's a lot more button pressing and like probably people doing tracks like I hit my drum machine every time, or I hit this pedal, to the beat to record this.
And that'll come back, I mean, we'll see both sides of that spectrum happen soon.
Yeah, it also reminds me of what you were saying back about colors and holograph and all of that has reminded me of the whole story of the chemical revolution. And do you know this one about like how they were trying to figure out in England in the 1800s what to do with all the coal tar that was building up in the street lamps before it was all electric. It was all coal gas. And they were like, oh, we have so much of this stuff. And the East India Company was happening and everyone was getting malaria. So they were like, well, they were making naphtha with it. They were taking it and rubbing it on fabric and making them waterproof. But they were using quinine to treat malaria. So they were like, and they were starting to play around with chemicals, and it was the tail end of like economic botany. And they were like, can we find some sort of quinine or some sort of, can we distill some sort of malaria medicine from this like thing that we have in excess, this byproduct? And the guy was in it. I forget I have his name here. Hold on. His name was William Henry Perkin. It was 1856. And he was, had like a distillation in a beaker of some sort of this coal tar, some reduced form of it, and it was just like a dark liquid. And he was like, oh, well, there's nothing there. And he went to pour it out, and he realized like in the light, as the light hit it, that it had a purple color, like it wasn't just black. And then he's like, oh, that's really interesting. And he made some different distillations of it, and it turned out to be like bright, like vibrant, like purple. And then they made a dye of it, and that was like that mauve colored dye that for the 1890s was called the mauve decade. And everyone was wearing this color because it was the first chemical dye that they'd synthesized. And then they realized that since like when you look at oil spilled in water, you see the rainbow there, that there was actually every color was possible from from that. And like this whole chemical revolution happened of like opening up the spectrum of color just from like a dark crud byproduct burnt material,
right.
you know, and
Amazing.
and yeah, just like how unexpectedly things can open up when you look at a particular point, you know, and then find that there's everything is in there. Because from there, that's, you know, they made plastics, they made medicines, like our whole world pretty much unraveled from that one moment.
Yeah, sort of what research I have on the docket. At first, you know, it was just the chakras, and even those were argued on their order and their color associations. And, you know, you especially have a history of thinking about which cultures thought of what colors as what their sources were. But yeah, trying to figure out what of that is phenomenal and what of that is, you know, the real deal, like the real thing of what we're seeing, how those different cultures found color and why, and what they thought of them. Even to the point, one of the things I have to read this week is Newton writing the Royal Society of in the late 1600s on, you know, when he sets up the prism, and then he writes the Royal Society, and he's like, guess what I'm about to figure out? Like, you have no idea, you know. It's like Newton seeing the chakras, and then how he spun that worldview based on looking at those colors as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The Pantone color of the year is ultraviolet, which coincides with the crown chakra. And I was kind of thinking that as like taking us into that air sign, that air quality, kind of getting us ready for it.
What is that? The Pantone color of the year?
They just choose a color every year.
Oh, okay. So they've chosen this color as that's really interesting. And then weren't we seeing colors related to violets and pinks like as in like popularly in fashion, like street fashion in the past last year? And
definitely. Yeah,
because there was like millennial pink, and then like that was like they termed it that really quickly, and then the next thing is a shade of violet, you know, and now we're like ascending into ultraviolet.
the fastest possible color we can imagine as being seeable.
It's becoming seeable. That like you touched on it, but when I was in India and Nepal, I was serving people. I would carry around a notebook, and I'd ask everyone I'd get talking to, once they were like, you know, when you're talking to someone and you can tell they're starting to get comfortable with you and familiar, I would just like lay it on them without any explanation. I'd just be like, well, what about blue? And then they'd just be like, blue. And I wouldn't even tell them why. You just put a question mark, you know, the sound of a question by raising the pitch of the end of the word, and people just start philosophizing the color instinctually, you know.
Right.
But I realized that they were all lined up to pretty much the astrology, because the astrology culturally is intact in India. It's just never like how they're still a polytheistic society, like unbroken, you know, as if in Greece, if they still worship Zeus, you know. So that astrology is still how they see color, or that at least that what's their version, or the correspondence of Neoplatonic thought, of course, like the doctrine of signatures, you know. Because, and I really realized from asking them like green, and they'd say like love, and they'd like touch their heart when they'd be like love, green is love, you know.
Right.
We're here, we're like red, you know, which is just like really funny just to think about that.
Mars.
Yeah, because of Mars, the West, like most of all of the Western and like half of the Eastern countries, or, you know, cultures going all the way back, Mars is, you know, red is rage, red is blood, red is fire.
Like the conquest of love.
Yeah, right.
And eating.
And eating, yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm into this golden turmeric color right now, which I can't really, you know, I don't even care why, really. I think it was like a certain amount of period went by, and a lot of my t-shirts were black, which I was sleeping in, right? It just felt really normal to wear like just a t-shirt to sleep in. And then I woke up one day with like the sunlight on my chest, and I was in a black shirt, and I was like, oh my God, like what am I doing to myself?
Yeah.
And then I started waking up in the golden turmeric color, and, you know, this would be the first thing I would see would be the sun on this golden color, and, you know, Marley would turn over and see that same color, and we would go like, ah. And so
Nice.
now that's the color for me right now.
That's really great. I'm going to start giving that as advice, because there's, with Uranus going into Taurus and seeing how it's affecting people's charts, like, the advice I keep giving is that we have to get into the experimental nature. Like, you have to like start, if it's affecting someone like heavily, like, oh, that's going to be a big shift for you, to before Uranus starts creating turbulence in your life to force you to innovate and experiment, to just start running experiments yourself. Right. And I keep telling people to, like, if your bed has your head facing north, switch it to south, so you wake up looking at different things the moment your eyes, or like, you know, switch your jewelry around or drive a different route to work. But yeah, like changing
yellow instead of black.
Right, yeah, changing the colors that you wear, especially waking up to. I think that's a key moment. Like what you know, what you like immediately read the moment you awake, you know.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps we should bring it to a close. Do you have anything else you want to talk about before we?
I think that's good. I think we covered most of it.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming back on, and we'll have you again
yes, please.
And you know,
the future.
In the future, the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
All right, guys.
Thanks.
One thing I wanted to add to this discussion that I didn't get to mention as something I was thinking about in relation to a holographic reality and how we perceive that, and entering into the new era, and how our ideas of our own minds and imaginations may change as our ideas of reality change, to think back to the pre-modern mind and the pre-modern conception of the imagination, and why perhaps the idea of the devil was so scary. That the prohibitions of Christianity in general, when you think what were they really doing, by and large, they were putting restrictions on our bodies, but also on our imaginations. And that before the rational enlightenment, the imagination was real. What you imagined, what you pictured, was closer to something that was actually manifest and something that was happening. And the importance now in our magical practice of knowing that our imaginations are a tool of manifestation, and that when the pre-modern person would imagine the devil, he would actually be there. He would be present, because the world was inhabited by spirit. And what takes place in the inlet and outlet of our imagination and creative faculties was an actual visitation and interaction with spirit. And that's the place where we interact with what's more. That's the liminal zone where we cross over. So just something I wanted to throw in there is trying to think, you know, how to keep chasing that devil and being able to locate him, and our ideas change about what our imagination does and what reality is and isn't. Just something to think about until we all speak again.